The scream died in Sarah Sinclair's throat as she dropped from the second-story window, her bare feet hitting the packed earth harder than she expected, sending jolts of pain through her ankles that she immediately ignored because stopping meant death or worse. She clutched nothing but the woolen dress on her back and a small leather pouch containing $23 she had stolen over 3 years from the man who called himself her husband, though he shared that title with 4 other women who looked at her with either pity or contempt, depending on the day. Behind her, the massive compound sat dark and silent against the Colorado night sky, its walls holding secrets that would make decent folk recoil in horror, and she ran toward the tree line with her heart hammering so hard she thought her ribs might crack. The year was 1881, and Colorado City sat in the shadow of Pikes Peak like a jewel that had rolled too far from civilization's careful hand. Sarah had been brought here at 18 by her father, who had fallen under the spell of Ezekiel Stone, a self-proclaimed prophet who preached that plural marriage brought men closer to God. Her father had died 6 months later in a mining accident, leaving her trapped in a marriage she had never truly consented to, bound to a man 30 years her senior who collected wives like other men collected cattle. She was 21 now, and if she did not escape tonight, Ezekiel would seal her fate by moving her into the locked rooms where the women who tried to leave were kept until their spirits broke completely. Her feet found the narrow trail that wound through the scrub pine and juniper, and she ran until her lungs burned, and her vision blurred with tears and exhaustion. The moon hung fat and silver overhead, providing enough light to keep her from breaking her neck on the rocky terrain, but also enough light for anyone pursuing her to track her movement. She needed help, needed someone who would not ask too many questions, needed someone brave enough or foolish enough to stand against Ezekiel Stone and the 12 armed men who served as his personal guard. The trail opened onto a wider road, and Sarah stumbled, catching herself on a wooden fence post that marked the boundary of someone's property. In the distance, she could see the warm glow of a single lamp burning in what looked like a barn, and desperation made her bold. She climbed the fence with shaking hands and made her way across the pasture where horses lifted their heads to watch her pass, their eyes reflecting moonlight like pools of liquid silver. The barn door stood partially open, and Sarah slipped inside, immediately enveloped by the warm smell of hay and horses and leather. A man knelt beside a mare in obvious distress, his hands gentle on her swollen belly as he murmured soft words of encouragement. He wore a dusty brown hat pushed back on his head, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, and when he turned at the sound of her footstep, she found herself looking into the most striking blue eyes she had ever seen. "Please," Sarah whispered, and the single word seemed to drain every ounce of strength she had left. Her knees buckled, and she would have fallen if the man had not moved with surprising speed, catching her before she hit the ground. "Easy now," he said, his voice low and calm, the kind of voice that could gentle a spooked horse or a terrified woman. "You are safe here. I have got you." His name was James Nolan, and he carried her to a small room at the back of the barn where he kept supplies, and sometimes slept when he had animals that needed watching through the night. He settled her onto a pile of blankets and brought her water in a tin cup that she drank so fast it ran down her chin. He did not ask questions right away, just watched her with those steady blue eyes while she caught her breath and tried to stop shaking. "There are men who will come looking for me," Sarah finally said, her voice hoarse. "Dangerous men. If they find me here, they will hurt you, maybe kill you. I should not have come, but I had nowhere else to go, and I saw your light, and I just thought maybe—" "Slow down," James said, holding up one hand. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled often, though he was not smiling now. Start from the beginning. Who are these men? What did they do to you? Sarah looked down at her hands, noticing for the first time that her palms were bleeding from her climb down the compound wall. The truth felt too large and too shameful to speak aloud, but what choice did she have? This man had kind eyes, and she needed kindness more than she needed her pride. I was married to Ezekiel Stone, she said quietly. Do you know the name? James's expression darkened immediately. The prophet up in that compound north of town. The one who has more wives than King Solomon and thinks the laws of decent society do not apply to him. Yes, that is him. I was his fifth wife, though he has been courting a sixth, a girl barely 16 years old. Sarah's hands clenched into fists. I ran tonight because I overheard him telling his guards that I needed correction, that I would be moved to the isolation rooms until I learned proper obedience. Women who go into those rooms come out different, broken, and I could not let that happen to me. James was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah braced herself for him to tell her to leave, to say that he wanted no part of this trouble. Instead, he stood and walked to a cabinet in the corner, pulling out a box that rattled with the sound of ammunition. He checked the revolver at his hip, then looked back at her with determination written across his features. How many men does he have guarding that compound? James asked. 12, maybe more. All of them armed and loyal to him completely. They think he speaks for God. Sarah stood on shaking legs. You cannot fight them. I just need a horse, maybe some supplies, and I will ride as far as I can before dawn. And then what? You think he will not send men after you? You think he will just let you go? James shook his head. No. If you want to disappear for good, we need to be smarter than just running blind into the night. The mare in the main part of the barn let out a distressed whinny, and James moved quickly back to her side. Sarah followed, watching as he examined the horse with practiced hands. His touch was gentle, confident, and the mare seemed to calm under his attention despite her obvious pain. She is trying to foal, but something is wrong, James said. The foal is positioned badly. I need to turn it, but I cannot do it alone. Can you help me? Sarah blinked in surprise. I do not know anything about birthing horses. You do not need to. I just need you to hold the lamp and hand me things when I ask. James looked at her with such trust that she found herself nodding before she had fully processed his request. For the next 2 hours, Sarah forgot about her fear and exhaustion as she assisted James in saving the mare and her foal. He talked her through everything he was doing, his voice never rising above that same calm tone even when the situation looked dire. His hands moved with skill and care, and when the foal finally slid free and took its first shuddering breath, Sarah felt tears streaming down her face for entirely different reasons than before. You did good, James said, looking up at her with a smile that transformed his entire face. Real good. This little one would not have made it without your help. You did all the work, Sarah protested, but she felt a small spark of pride warming her chest. We make a decent team. James stood and wiped his hands on a cloth, then extended one to her. James Nolan. I run this ranch with my younger brother, though he is in Denver right now buying breeding stock. It is just me here for another week. Sarah Sinclair, she replied, taking his hand. His grip was warm and strong, calloused from hard work. Thank you for not turning me away. I would never turn away someone in need, especially not someone running from a man like Ezekiel Stone. I have heard stories about that compound, about things he does to women who displease him. If even half of what I have heard is true, then you were right to run. James's expression grew serious again. But running is not enough. We need a plan to make sure he can never find you. They walked back to the small room, and James pulled out a map of Colorado and the surrounding territories. He spread it across a wooden crate and studied it with narrowed eyes, tracing routes with one finger while Sarah watched and tried to ignore how safe she felt standing next to him. "Stone has connections throughout Colorado," James said. "He does business with merchants in town, has friends among some of the less reputable types in Denver. If you just run, he will find you eventually. But if we make him think you went somewhere you did not, if we create a false trail, then maybe we can buy you enough time to truly disappear." "How?" Sarah asked. "Tomorrow, I will ride into Colorado City and make some noise about how I am headed to Santa Fe to buy horses. I will mention it at the saloon, the general store, anywhere people gossip. Then I will buy a ticket on the evening stage heading south and make sure people see me leave." James looked up at her. "But I will not be on that stage. I will circle back here and you and I will head north into Wyoming instead. By the time Stone's men figure out the trail is false, we will be long gone. Why would you do this for me?" "You do not even know me," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. James was quiet for a moment, his blue eyes searching her face. "Because it is the right thing to do. Because no woman should have to live in fear of the man who is supposed to protect her. And because when I look at you, I see someone worth saving." He cleared his throat as if embarrassed by his own honesty. "You can trust me, Sarah. I give you my word that I will get you somewhere safe." Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the tight bands of fear that had held her for so long. This stranger with kind eyes and gentle hands was offering her something she had thought lost forever: hope. "What about your ranch, your brother?" "You cannot just abandon everything," she said. "My brother can manage things here. I will send him a telegram once we are far enough away. As for the ranch, it will still be here when I get back." James folded the map. "Assuming I come back at all, Wyoming has good ranching country. Might be time for a fresh start." The implications of his words hung in the air between them, and Sarah felt her cheeks warm despite everything. She barely knew this man, and yet he was prepared to upend his entire life to help her escape. It seemed impossible, too good to be true, and yet here he stood with determination written in every line of his body. "You should rest," James said, breaking the tension. "You are exhausted, and we have a long day ahead of us tomorrow. I will keep watch in case anyone comes looking." Sarah wanted to argue, but her body betrayed her with a jaw-cracking yawn. James smiled and handed her a thick blanket, then left the room to give her privacy. She lay down on the pile of blankets, which smelled like hay and sunshine, and despite all her fears, she fell asleep almost immediately. She woke to the sound of voices, and for a heart-stopping moment, she thought Ezekiel's men had found her. But then she recognized James's voice, calm and steady, talking to someone else whose tone was higher-pitched and uncertain. Sarah crept to the door and peered out to see James standing with a boy of perhaps 14, who held the reins of a sweating horse. "I am telling you, Mr. Nolan, they are asking everyone if they have seen a woman matching her description. They have got men searching every barn and outbuilding between here and the compound." The boy's eyes were wide with fear. "Mr. Stone himself came into town, and he looks madder than a rattlesnake in a boot. He is offering a $50 reward for information leading to her return." "That's so." James's voice remained even. "Well, I have not seen any strange women around here, Charlie, but I appreciate you riding out to warn me. Here is $1 for your trouble." The boy took the coin and nodded gratefully before riding off. James waited until he was out of sight, then turned toward the room where Sarah hid. She stepped out, her face pale. $50, she whispered. "That is more than most men make in 2 months. Someone will turn me in for that kind of money." Not if they do not know you are here. James's jaw was set in a stubborn line. We move up our timeline. I am going into town now to set up the false trail. You stay here, keep out of sight, and if anyone comes, you hide in the hay loft. There is a loose board in the back corner that opens to a space big enough for you to squeeze through. Can you do that? Sarah nodded, though her hands were shaking again. James reached out and took both her hands in his, the gesture so unexpectedly gentle that she looked up in surprise. I will not let him take you back there, James said, his voice fierce. I promise you that, Sarah. Whatever it takes, I will keep you safe. Why? She asked again, needing to understand what would drive a man to risk so much for a stranger. James's expression softened. Because I had a sister once. She married a man who hurt her, who made her life a living hell, and when she asked our family for help, our father told her that she had made her bed and must lie in it. She took her own life a year later. I was 15, and I swore that day that if I ever had the chance to help a woman escape a bad situation, I would move heaven and earth to do it. His hands tightened on hers. So that is why, Sarah. Because maybe if I help you, it will balance the scales a little for not being able to help my sister. Sarah felt tears burning her eyes. She had grown so used to cruelty disguised as righteousness, to men who justified their actions with scripture and divine mandate. To have this cowboy stand before her and offer help simply because it was the right thing to do felt like stepping from darkness into sunlight. Thank you, she whispered, and the words felt pitifully inadequate for the gift he was giving her. James squeezed her hands once more, then released them and headed for the barn door. Stay hidden. I will be back by early afternoon, and then we ride north as soon as it is dark enough to cover our tracks. Sarah spent the day in an agony of waiting, every sound making her jump, every shadow appearing like one of Ezekiel's men come to drag her back. She found the hiding spot James had mentioned and practiced squeezing through the narrow opening until she could do it quickly, even in the dark. The space beyond was cramped and musty, but it was well hidden, and she supposed that was all that mattered. True to his word, James returned in the early afternoon, his saddlebags bulging with supplies. He looked pleased with himself as he unpacked food, ammunition, and clothing that he spread out on the workbench. The whole town is buzzing about the prophet's missing wife, James reported. I made sure to mention loudly at the saloon that I was heading to Santa Fe tonight. Even bought a stage ticket and showed it around. Then I happened to mention that I saw a woman matching the description heading east toward the Kansas border just this morning, looking like she was in a powerful hurry. He grinned. By now, half of Stone's men are probably racing toward Kansas. And the other half, Sarah asked, will be watching the stage to Santa Fe, I would wager, which is why neither of us will be on it. James pulled out a set of men's clothing and held it up. These belonged to my brother when he was younger. They should fit you well enough. You will need to bind your chest and tuck your hair up under this hat. In the dark, you will pass for a young man, and that will make it easier for us to travel without drawing attention. Sarah took the clothes, touched by his thoughtfulness. You have thought of everything. I have had all day to plan while I was running around town playing the part of a fool cowboy with a loose tongue. James's smile faded. There is something else you should know. I saw Ezekiel stone himself at the general store. He is not what I expected. What do you mean? I thought he would look like a monster, but he just looks like a man. A well-dressed man with a pleasant face, who speaks softly and thanks people for their help. It made my skin crawl because I know what he is under that civilized veneer. James's hands clenched into fists. He looked right at me, Sarah, and for a moment I thought he knew. But then he just nodded and went about his business. Sarah felt cold fear wash over her. He is good at reading people. It is how he controls everyone around him. He knows exactly what to say, how to act to make people trust him. Well, he did not read me correctly because I smiled and tipped my hat like any other citizen, and now he thinks I am on his side. James checked the revolver at his hip again. We leave as soon as the sun sets. I want to put as many miles between us and this place as possible before morning. They spent the remaining hours preparing for the journey. James saddled 2 horses, both strong and sure-footed, built for distance rather than speed. He packed supplies with the efficiency of someone who had spent half his life on the trail, and Sarah changed into the men's clothing, feeling strange and exposed in trousers. She braided her long brown hair tightly and pinned it up under the hat, then looked at herself in the small mirror James provided. "What do you think?" she asked, turning so he could see. James studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You make a passable young man, but your face is too fine, too delicate. We will need to keep your head down and not let people look at you too closely." He hesitated, then added, "Though I confess I prefer you as you are." Sarah felt warmth creep up her neck at the compliment. She was not used to men complimenting her appearance unless it was to assess her worth as property. James's words felt different, genuine, and she found herself smiling despite her nerves. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the Colorado sky in shades of orange and purple, James and Sarah led the horses out of the barn. The evening air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of sage and pine from the mountains. Sarah took one last look at the barn that had sheltered her for the past day, then turned her face toward the north and whatever future awaited her there. They rode in silence for the first hour, following trails that James knew well, keeping to the shadows and avoiding the main road. Sarah was not an experienced rider, but she had learned the basics during her time in Colorado, and the horse James had chosen for her was patient and steady. Still, her muscles ached, and she wondered how long she could maintain this pace. "We will stop to rest the horses in another hour," James said, as if reading her thoughts. "There is a creek about 5 miles north where we can water them and take a break ourselves. After that, we will ride through most of the night to put more distance between us and Colorado City." "Have you done this before, helped someone disappear?" Sarah asked. "No, but I have spent enough time tracking cattle thieves and lost stock to know how to cover a trail." James glanced back at her. "How are you holding up?" "I am fine," Sarah lied, not wanting to slow them down. James made a sound that suggested he did not believe her, but let it pass. They rode on as the sky darkened and stars began to appear overhead, countless points of light that seemed close enough to touch in the thin mountain air. Sarah had always loved the stars, had spent many nights during her imprisonment staring up at them through her window and dreaming of freedom. Now that she had it, it felt both exhilarating and terrifying. They reached the creek exactly when James predicted, and Sarah slid from her horse with a barely suppressed groan. Her legs felt like rubber, and she had to grab the saddle to keep from falling. James was beside her in an instant, his hand steadying her. "Easy. Your body is not used to riding this long. You need to stretch, or you will be too sore to continue tomorrow." He demonstrated some simple stretches, and Sarah copied him, grateful for the relief it provided. While the horses drank from the creek and cropped at the grass along its banks, James built a tiny fire shielded by rocks so the light would not be visible from a distance. He heated coffee and shared out jerky and hard biscuits that tasted like sawdust but filled her empty stomach. "Tell me about your life before Ezekiel Stone," James said as they ate. "Who were you before all this?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, trying to remember the girl she had been before her father's death, before the compound and the fear. "I was nobody special." My mother died when I was young, so it was just my father and me. He worked as a surveyor and we moved around a lot. I learned to read and write, which was more than most girls got, and I loved books more than anything. She smiled at the memory. I used to imagine I would grow up and become a teacher, maybe open a school somewhere. Foolish dreams. Not foolish, James said firmly. Dreams are what keep us human, what keep us fighting when things get hard. What about you? What are your dreams? Sarah asked, genuinely curious about this man who had risked everything for her. James stared into the fire, his expression thoughtful. I always wanted to build something that would last. A ranch that I could pass down to my children, a place where people and animals were treated with respect and kindness. My father was a hard man, quick with his fists and slow with praise. When he died, I swore I would be different, would build something better. He looked up at her. I suppose I am still working on that. I think you have succeeded already, Sarah said softly. You are a good man, James Nolan, better than you probably realize. Their eyes met across the fire, and Sarah felt something pass between them, a connection that went beyond gratitude or simple attraction. In that moment, she saw a future she had not dared imagine, one where she was free and safe and perhaps even loved by a man who would never seek to control her. James cleared his throat and looked away first, his cheeks slightly flushed. We should get moving again. We have a lot of ground to cover before dawn. They extinguished the fire and mounted up, continuing north through country that grew increasingly rugged and wild. The moon rose, providing enough light to navigate by, and Sarah found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the ride despite her aching muscles. There was something peaceful about traveling through the night with only the sound of hoofbeats and the occasional call of an owl to break the silence. As the hours passed, Sarah began to feel truly free for the first time in 3 years. Every mile they traveled was another mile between her and Ezekiel Stone, another step toward a life she could call her own. She looked at James's broad back ahead of her, steady and sure in the saddle, and felt a rush of affection for this stranger who had become her salvation. Dawn found them in Wyoming territory, high up in country where pine trees grew thick, and the air was so cold it made their breath steam. James led them off the trail to a small clearing where a fallen log provided shelter from the wind. They dismounted stiffly, and Sarah had to bite back a whimper as her abused muscles protested. We will rest here for a few hours, James said. The horses need it, and so do we. I will take first watch while you sleep. I can take a turn watching, Sarah offered, but James shook his head. You are exhausted and you need rest more than I do. Sleep, Sarah. I will wake you if there is trouble. Too tired to argue, Sarah wrapped herself in a blanket and lay down on a bed of pine needles that smelled sharp and clean. She thought she would be too anxious to sleep, but the moment she closed her eyes, she tumbled into darkness. She woke to the smell of bacon frying and sat up in confusion, momentarily disoriented. James crouched by a small fire, cooking breakfast with the ease of long practice. The sun was high overhead, which meant she had slept for several hours at least. I am sorry, Sarah said, pushing the blanket aside. You should have woken me for my turn at watch. You needed the rest. James handed her a tin plate with bacon and beans. Besides, I am used to managing on little sleep. Ranching tends to teach you that skill quickly. They ate in comfortable silence, and Sarah marveled at how natural it felt to be sitting here in the wilderness with this man she had known for barely a day. She had spent 3 years surrounded by people in the compound, and yet had never felt anything but alone. Now, with just James for company, she felt more connected than she had in years. Where exactly are we heading? Sarah asked as they cleaned up from breakfast. There is a town called Laramie about 2 days' ride from here. It is big enough that two strangers will not draw much attention, and I know some people there who might be able to help us establish new identities for you." James packed away the cooking supplies. "After that, we can decide together where you want to go, what kind of life you want to build." "Together," Sarah repeated, her heart beating faster. James looked up, and for the first time she saw uncertainty in his eyes. "If you want. I know we barely know each other, and I do not want to presume anything, but I meant what I said about maybe not going back to Colorado. I could find work in Wyoming, maybe start that ranch I always dreamed about." He paused. "And if you wanted to stay to be part of that dream, I would be honored." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "You barely know me. How can you be sure you would want that?" "I know enough," James said simply. "I know you are brave because you chose to run rather than accept a life of fear. I know you are strong because you are still standing after 3 years of hell. I know you are kind because of the way you helped with the foal even though you were terrified." He took a step closer. "And I know that when I look at you, I see a future worth fighting for. Maybe that makes me a fool, but it is the truth." Sarah crossed the distance between them and took his hands, rough and warm, in hers. "Then I suppose we are both fools because I feel the same way. I do not understand it, but from the moment you caught me in that barn, I felt safe for the first time in years. Not just physically safe, but safe in my heart." She looked up at him through her lashes. "If you are offering me a chance to be part of your dream, then yes, James Nolan. 1,000 times yes." James's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. He raised one hand to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing across her skin with infinite gentleness. "Then we will build something good together, something honest and true, where neither of us has to hide or be afraid." He leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, but Sarah rose on her toes to meet him halfway. Their lips met in a kiss that was sweet and careful, full of promise rather than demand. It was nothing like the perfunctory kisses Ezekiel had bestowed on her, cold and possessive. This kiss felt like coming home, like finding something she had not known she was searching for. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard, and James rested his forehead against hers. "We should keep moving," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "The sooner we reach Laramie, the sooner we can stop running and start living." They rode through the afternoon and into the evening, stopping only to rest the horses and eat a cold supper. The country around them was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way, all steep mountains and deep valleys covered in pine and aspen. Sarah saw elk grazing in a meadow and watched a golden eagle soar overhead, its wings spread wide against the impossibly blue sky. Everything felt more vivid, more alive than it had in years. On the second day, they descended from the high country toward the town of Laramie. Sarah felt her nervousness return as buildings appeared on the horizon. What if someone recognized her despite her disguise? What if Ezekiel had somehow figured out where they were heading? James seemed to sense her fear because he reached over and squeezed her hand briefly. "Trust me," he said simply, and somehow she did. Laramie was larger than Colorado City, a bustling town built along the railroad line with all the noise and energy that came with commerce and progress. James led them to a modest hotel on a quiet side street and secured 2 rooms, paying in cash and giving false names. Only when they were safely inside did Sarah allow herself to relax slightly. "Tomorrow, I will go see an old friend who might be able to help with documents," James said as they stood in the hallway between their rooms. "Tonight, you should rest. Take a real bath, sleep in a real bed. You have earned it." Sarah nodded but found herself reluctant to let him go. "James, thank you for everything. I know I keep saying it, but I do not think I can ever truly express what this means to me." "You do not have to thank me," James said, but his expression was warm, Get some rest, Sarah. Tomorrow, we start building that future we talked about. The next morning, Sarah woke in a real bed for the first time in days, feeling simultaneously more rested and more nervous than she had since their flight began. She washed carefully and dressed in her women's clothing again, grateful to be out of the binding trousers and loose shirt. When James knocked on her door an hour later, she saw his eyes widen slightly at the sight of her. "You look beautiful," he said, then seemed embarrassed by his own forwardness. "I mean, you always look beautiful, but in a dress you look more like yourself." "I feel more like myself," Sarah admitted, "though I suppose that is dangerous here. Not as dangerous as you think. Come with me. I want you to meet someone." James led her through the streets of Laramie to a small photography studio tucked between a dry goods store and a lawyer's office. Inside, a man with thinning hair and wire-rimmed spectacles looked up from a camera he was adjusting. "James Nolan, as I live and breathe," the man said, breaking into a smile. "I heard you were ranching down in Colorado. What brings you to Laramie?" "New opportunities, Marcus," James said, shaking the man's hand. "I would like you to meet Sarah Nolan, my wife." Sarah's head snapped toward James in shock, but his expression pleaded with her to play along. Marcus did not seem to notice her surprise, just offered his hand with a friendly smile. "Congratulations on your marriage. I had no idea you were even courting anyone." Marcus gestured toward two chairs set up in front of a painted backdrop. "Are you here for a wedding photograph? I have a new process that produces remarkably clear images." "Actually, we need something a bit different," James said. "My wife lost all her papers in a fire, and we need new documents to establish her identity. Birth certificate, marriage license, that sort of thing. I remember you have a talent for such work." Marcus's friendly expression shifted to something more cautious. "That is specialized work, James. The kind that could get a man in trouble if he is not careful, and expensive." "I can pay whatever you need," James said. "This is important, Marcus. Sarah needs a fresh start, and I need to know she is protected legally." Marcus looked between them, his sharp eyes missing nothing Sarah suspected. Finally, he nodded. "For you, I will do it, but the work will take a few days, and you will owe me a favor down the line." "Done," James said immediately. Over the next week, Sarah and James settled into a strange kind of domestic routine in Laramie. Marcus worked on creating a complete paper trail for Sarah Nolan, born in Kansas, and married to James just a month ago. Meanwhile, James made inquiries about land available for purchase in the area and spent his evenings with Sarah, walking along the streets of Laramie or eating dinner in quiet restaurants where they could talk without fear of being overheard. Sarah found herself falling deeper in love with him with each passing day. James was unlike any man she had ever known, treating her as an equal partner rather than property to be managed. He asked her opinions on everything from what kind of ranch they should build to what color curtains she might like in their future home. He made her laugh with stories from his childhood and listened with genuine interest when she shared her own dreams and fears. One evening, as they walked along the river that ran through town, James stopped and turned to face her. The setting sun cast golden light across his face, making his blue eyes seem to glow. "Sarah, I need to tell you something," he said, taking both her hands in his. "When I told Marcus you were my wife, it was a lie to protect you, but I find myself wishing it were not a lie. These past days with you have been the happiest of my life, and I cannot imagine going forward without you by my side." Sarah's heart felt like it might burst from her chest. "James, I feel the same way, but we have only known each other for a little over a week. Are you certain this is not just the excitement of our situation, the danger making everything feel more intense than it really is?" "I have thought about that," James admitted. But I do not think that is what this is. When I look at you, I see my future. I see children running through fields. I see growing old together on a porch watching the sun set. I see building something real and lasting with a woman I respect and admire. He took a deep breath. Sarah Sinclair, will you marry me? Truly marry me, not just on paper but in our hearts and before God. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she nodded. Yes, 1,000 times yes. James pulled her into his arms and kissed her deeply, and Sarah melted into his embrace. Everything that had seemed broken and impossible just weeks ago now felt full of hope and promise. She had escaped one form of marriage that had been a prison, and now she was choosing freely to enter another that felt like liberation. They were married a week later in a simple ceremony at a small church in Laramie, with Marcus and his wife serving as witnesses. Sarah wore a dress of pale blue that James had bought for her, and she carried a bouquet of wildflowers that James had picked himself that morning. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Sarah felt like she was finally, truly whole. With Marcus's help, Sarah's new identity was complete and legal in every way that mattered. Sarah Nolan was a real person with real documents, and Ezekiel Stone would never be able to find her even if he somehow tracked her to Wyoming. The relief Sarah felt was profound, but it was nothing compared to the joy of being married to a man who loved her freely and without conditions. James found land for sale about 10 miles outside of Laramie, a beautiful spread with good water and plenty of grass for cattle and horses. The property included a small cabin that needed work but had good bones, and James and Sarah threw themselves into the task of making it a home. They spent their days repairing walls and building furniture, and their nights learning each other in the way of new husbands and wives. Sarah discovered that James was a patient and tender lover, always concerned with her comfort and pleasure. After years of enduring Ezekiel's cold, perfunctory attention, being with James felt like a revelation. He made her feel cherished and desired in a way she had not known was possible, and she blossomed under his care. As autumn turned to winter, their little ranch began to take shape. James bought a small herd of cattle and several horses, and Sarah started a garden that she planned to expand come spring. They hired a young man named Thomas to help with the heavy work, and slowly, they built the life James had dreamed of. Sarah found herself healing in ways she had not expected. The nightmares that had plagued her since her escape became less frequent, and the constant anxiety that had defined her existence in the compound gradually faded. James's steady presence and unconditional love created a safe space where she could finally begin to process all the trauma she had endured. One evening in early December, as they sat by the fire in their cabin, Sarah shared something she had never told another living soul. "There was another woman in the compound," she said quietly. "Her name was Rebecca, and she was Ezekiel's third wife. She tried to escape once, about a year before I ran. They caught her before she made it 5 miles, and Ezekiel made an example of her." Sarah's hands clenched in her lap. "He did not kill her, but what he did was worse in some ways. He broke her spirit so completely that she became like a ghost, just going through the motions of living without any life in her eyes. I used to look at her and think that would be me someday if I did not get out." James pulled her close, his arms strong and protective around her. "That will never be you. You are safe now, Sarah, safe and loved and free." "I know," Sarah whispered against his chest, "but sometimes I still feel guilty that I escaped and she did not. That I found happiness and she is still there, trapped in that hell." "You cannot save everyone," James said gently. "But maybe someday, when enough time has passed and it is safe to do so, we can find a way to help others like Rebecca." We can be a place where women fleeing bad situations can find shelter and assistance. Would that help ease your guilt? Sarah pulled back to look at him, love shining in her eyes. You would do that. Open our home to strangers who might bring danger to our doorstep. If it means helping people who need it, then yes. We have been blessed, Sarah. We have safety and love and a future. Sharing those blessings with others seems like the least we can do. Sarah kissed him deeply, overwhelmed by his goodness. How did I get so lucky to find you? I think I am the lucky one, James countered with a smile. You brought light into my life that I did not even know was missing. As winter deepened, Sarah discovered she was pregnant. The realization filled her with both joy and terror in equal measure. She had seen what happened to women in the compound when they bore children, how they became even more trapped by the responsibility of motherhood. But James's reaction when she told him erased all her fears. A baby, he said, his voice full of wonder. He placed both hands on her still flat stomach with infinite gentleness. We are going to have a baby. Sarah, that is wonderful. That is the best news I could ever imagine. His genuine excitement and joy made Sarah cry, though these were happy tears rather than the bitter ones she had shed so often in her previous life. James spent the next weeks reading everything he could find about pregnancy and childbirth, determined to be as prepared as possible. He fussed over Sarah constantly, making sure she rested enough and ate well and did not overwork herself. I am pregnant, not fragile, Sarah protested one day when James insisted she should not carry a bucket of water from the well. I know, James said, taking the bucket from her anyway. But you are carrying our child, and that makes you precious beyond measure. Humor me, Sarah. Let me take care of you. How could she argue with that? So Sarah allowed herself to be pampered and cared for in a way she had never experienced. She watched her body change with fascination rather than fear, and she began to imagine the future that awaited their child. A future where he or she would grow up loved and valued, where they would be taught that all people deserved respect and kindness, where they would never know the kind of fear that had defined Sarah's young adulthood. Spring came early to Wyoming that year, bringing wildflowers and new grass and longer days. Sarah's pregnancy progressed smoothly, and by the time summer arrived, she was gloriously, obviously with child. James could not keep his hands off her expanding belly, always talking to the baby and telling stories about the ranch they would explore together. In late August, when the heat shimmered over the grasslands and the cicadas sang their endless song, Sarah went into labor. James stayed by her side through all of it, holding her hand and whispering encouragement even when she cursed him for getting her into this condition. Thomas had fetched the midwife from town, a capable woman named Martha who had delivered hundreds of babies, and approached the process with calm efficiency. After 12 hours of hard labor, Sarah delivered a healthy baby boy with a strong set of lungs and a full head of dark hair. James wept openly when Martha placed the baby in his arms, and Sarah felt her heart expand to hold this new, overwhelming love. What should we name him? James asked, his voice thick with emotion as he gazed at their son. Jacob, Sarah said without hesitation. Jacob Nolan. A strong name for a strong boy. Jacob, James repeated, testing the name. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. The first months of Jacob's life were exhausting but filled with joy. Sarah had worried she would not know how to be a good mother, but the instinct came naturally, and James proved to be a devoted father who did not consider caring for his son beneath him. Many nights, Sarah would wake to find James walking the floor with Jacob, singing off-key lullabies and looking completely content. As Jacob grew from an infant into a curious toddler, Sarah and James settled deeper into their life together. The ranch prospered under James's management, and they hired 2 more hands to help with the work. Word began to spread quietly through certain channels that the Nolan ranch was a safe place for women in trouble, and twice in Jacob's first 2 years, they sheltered women fleeing abusive situations, helping them establish new identities and find safe places to rebuild their lives. One of these women was a young girl named Ellen, barely 19, who arrived at their door in the dead of winter with frostbite and a haunted look in her eyes. She had been married off to a man 40 years her senior who beat her regularly, and she had finally gathered the courage to run. Sarah saw herself in Ellen's fear and desperation, and she took the girl under her wing, helping her heal both physically and emotionally. Ellen stayed with them for 3 months, recovering and learning skills that would help her make her own way in the world. When she finally left to take a position as a teacher in a town 200 miles away, she hugged Sarah tightly. "You saved my life," Ellen said, tears streaming down her face. "I do not know how to thank you." "Live well," Sarah told her. "Be happy. That is thanks enough." After Ellen left, James found Sarah standing on their porch, looking out over the land they had built together. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back against his solid warmth. "You did a good thing helping her," James said. "We did a good thing," Sarah corrected. "None of this would be possible without you, James. You gave me a chance at a life I never thought I could have." "We gave each other that chance," James said. "But I am proud of what we have built here. Not just the ranch, but the refuge we have created for people who need it." Years passed in a blur of seasons and growing children. Sarah gave birth to 2 more children, a daughter they named Sophia, and another son they named Samuel. The cabin was expanded into a proper house with room for their growing family, and the ranch continued to prosper. Sarah started a school in town, finally achieving the dream she had harbored as a young girl, and James became known throughout the territory as a fair and honorable rancher. Jacob grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved books as much as his mother and horses as much as his father. Sophia was spirited and curious, always getting into mischief and asking questions that left her parents scrambling for answers. Samuel was still a toddler, but he showed signs of having his father's calm temperament and his mother's determination. One evening, when Jacob was 8 and asking questions about where his mother came from, Sarah decided it was time to share her story. She told her children an edited version of her escape from the compound, emphasizing the importance of treating all people with respect and never allowing others to control them through fear. "But what happened to the bad man?" Sophia asked, her eyes wide. "Did he ever stop being bad?" Sarah exchanged a glance with James. They had kept track of Ezekiel Stone over the years through occasional newspaper reports and word from travelers. The prophet's influence had waned as the territory became more settled and law-abiding. Several of his wives had eventually escaped, and he had been arrested twice for fraud, though he always seemed to wriggle free of serious consequences. "Some people never change," Sarah told her daughter honestly. "But the important thing is that the women he hurt found their way to freedom and safety, and that is what matters." "Like the ladies who come to stay with us sometimes?" Jacob asked, demonstrating the perceptiveness that sometimes surprised his parents. "Yes, exactly like that," James said, pulling Jacob onto his lap. "Our family believes in helping people who need it, especially those who are treated unfairly. That is part of what makes us who we are." As their children grew older, Sarah found herself reflecting often on the night she had dropped from that window in Colorado City, terrified and desperate and certain she would not survive. She thought about the girl she had been then, broken and hopeless, and marveled at the woman she had become. A woman with a family she adored, a purpose that fulfilled her, and love that sustained her through every challenge. On their 10th wedding anniversary, James took Sarah back to the spot where he had proposed by the river in Laramie. They stood hand in hand, watching the water flow past, both of them older and bearing the marks of lives well lived. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked. "Giving up your ranch in Colorado, uprooting your entire life for a woman you barely knew?" James turned to face her, his blue eyes still as striking as the first night she had stumbled into his barn. "Not for a single moment. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Sarah Nolan. You and our children and this life we have built together. If I could go back to that night and do it all over again, I would not change a thing. Not even the part where you had to deliver a difficult foal while hiding a fugitive in your barn," Sarah teased. James laughed, the sound rich and warm. "Especially not that part. That was when I knew you were special, the way you jumped in to help without hesitation despite being terrified. That was when I started falling in love with you, though I did not recognize it at the time." Sarah kissed him, pouring a decade of love and gratitude into the gesture. "I love you, James Nolan. Thank you for giving me a life worth living." "Thank you for trusting me enough to let me be part of it," James replied. They stood together as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, and Sarah felt a deep sense of peace. She had escaped a nightmare and found a dream she had not dared imagine. She had disappeared from her old life completely, leaving behind Sarah Sinclair, the plural wife, and becoming fully Sarah Nolan, beloved wife and mother and teacher and friend. The past would always be part of her story, but it no longer defined her. She had built something new and beautiful from the ashes of her old life, and she knew with absolute certainty that she would spend the rest of her days being grateful for the cowboy who had helped her disappear for good, and then given her a reason to want to be found. Years continued to unfold like the pages of a cherished book. Jacob went off to university in Denver to study law, determined to help people who could not help themselves. Sophia became a doctor, inspired by the midwife who had delivered her youngest brother, and driven by a desire to serve women who lacked proper medical care. Samuel took over more and more of the ranch operations, showing a natural talent for animal husbandry and land management that made his father burst with pride. Sarah continued teaching, touching the lives of countless children over the decades. She became known throughout Wyoming as a champion of education, particularly for girls who were often denied opportunities for learning. She never forgot what it felt like to have her choices stolen from her, and she dedicated herself to ensuring the next generation would have the freedom to choose their own paths. James remained her partner in every sense of the word. They weathered droughts and harsh winters, financial difficulties and personal losses. When James's brother died unexpectedly, leaving behind a young widow and 2 children, they took the family in without hesitation. When disease swept through the cattle herd one terrible year, they rebuilt from almost nothing, supporting each other through the stress and uncertainty. Through it all, their love never wavered. If anything, it grew stronger with each passing year, deepening into something rare and precious. They knew each other completely, could read each other's moods with a glance, could communicate volumes with a touch. They had been forged together in fire and had emerged as something unbreakable. On their 25th anniversary, their children threw them a surprise party at the ranch. Friends and neighbors came from miles around to celebrate the couple who had become pillars of their community. As Sarah looked around at the faces of people she loved, at the home she and James had built, at the family they had created together, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. That night, after all the guests had left and the house had quieted, James found Sarah standing in their bedroom, looking at an old photograph Marcus had taken of them shortly after their wedding. They looked so young in the picture, though Sarah could see the wariness in her own eyes that had taken years to fade completely. "We were babies," James said, coming to stand beside her. "We were," Sarah agreed. "But look how far we have come." James wrapped his arms around her and they swayed together in the lamplight. "I would do it all again," he murmured into her hair. "Every difficult moment, every challenge, every sacrifice, all of it was worth it to end up here with you." Sarah turned in his arms and looked up at the man who had been her salvation and her love for 25 years. His dark hair was shot through with silver now, and lines bracketed his eyes and mouth. But to her, he was as handsome as the day she had first seen him in that barn. "You gave me a life," she said simply. "A real life, full of love and purpose and joy. I was dead inside that compound, James, dead in every way that mattered. You brought me back to life and showed me what it means to be truly loved. That is a gift beyond measure." They made love that night with the tenderness of long familiarity mixed with the passion that had never quite faded. Afterwards, lying in the darkness with James's heartbeat steady beneath her ear, Sarah thought about the girl who had fled into the night all those years ago. She wished she could go back and tell that terrified girl that everything would be all right, that she would find her way to happiness beyond anything she could imagine. But perhaps the struggle had been necessary. Perhaps she would not appreciate the beauty of her life now if she had not experienced the darkness first. The scars she carried from her time in the compound had healed but never fully disappeared, and she bore them as reminders of where she had been and how far she had traveled. More years passed, bringing grandchildren and new challenges and new joys. Sarah and James grew old together with grace, their love story becoming something of a legend in their corner of Wyoming. Young couples would point to them as an example of what marriage should be, and Sarah always felt a little embarrassed by the attention even as she treasured it. When James was 72, he suffered a heart attack while working with a difficult horse. For 3 terrifying days, Sarah sat by his bedside in the hospital in Laramie, holding his hand and praying to a God she had complicated feelings about but who she hoped might show mercy. Their children gathered from across the territory, bringing grandchildren who sat quietly in the waiting room and whispered about whether Grandpa would be all right. James pulled through, stubborn and strong even in the face of mortality, but the incident shook them both. They realized how precious their time together was, how every day was a gift that should not be taken for granted. "I am not ready to lose you," Sarah whispered one night after he had returned home and was recovering. "You are not going to lose me," James promised, though they both knew he could not control such things. "But Sarah, if something does happen to me, I need you to know something. These decades with you have been the greatest blessing of my life. You made me a better man. You gave me a purpose beyond myself. If I died tomorrow, I would die completely satisfied with the life I have lived." "Do not talk like that," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "I am not being morbid, just honest," James said gently, wiping away her tears. "But I plan to stick around for a good while longer. We have grandchildren to spoil and probably great-grandchildren somewhere down the line. I am not going anywhere if I can help it." True to his word, James recovered fully and remained active well into his late 70s. He and Sarah celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary, surrounded by a family that had grown to include dozens of children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, and adopted relations. It was a loud, chaotic, beautiful celebration that left them both exhausted and deeply happy. As they sat on their porch that evening, watching the sun set over land that had been their home for more than 5 decades, James took Sarah's hand in his gnarled one. 50 years, he said. shaking his head in wonder. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I found you in my barn, scared and desperate. And sometimes it feels like we have always been together, like there was never a time when you were not part of my life." "I know what you mean," Sarah said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "You are woven into every part of who I am, James. I cannot imagine existing without you." "You will not have to for a long while yet," James said firmly. "We have a deal, remember. We grow old together and drive our children crazy with our stubbornness and tell embarrassing stories to our grandchildren." Sarah laughed, the sound still bright despite her years. "That was the deal, and you always keep your promises." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell and stars emerged overhead, the same stars that had guided their flight north so many years ago. Sarah thought about all the women they had helped over the decades, all the lives they had touched and changed. She thought about the family they had built and the love they had shared. She thought about the girl who had escaped a polygamous marriage in the night and the cowboy who had helped her disappear for good, and how that terrifying night had been the beginning of the greatest adventure of her life. "No regrets?" James asked, as if reading her thoughts. "Not a single one," Sarah said firmly. "Not one single regret, only gratitude for every moment, good and bad, that brought us to this place." James raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "That is my girl. Always seeing the light even in the darkness." "You taught me how to do that," Sarah said. "You showed me that life could be beautiful and full of love. Everything good in my life started the night I stumbled into your barn." "Everything good in my life started that night too," James said. "We saved each other, Sarah. That is what makes our story so special. We saved each other and built something that will outlast us both." And he was right. Long after Sarah and James were both gone, their family continued to thrive in Wyoming. The ranch they had built remained in the family, passed down through generations who honored their legacy. The stories of Sarah's courage and James's kindness were told and retold, inspiring others to choose love over fear and freedom over control. Their great-grandchildren would stand on the porch of the old house and look out over the land, and they would feel the presence of the remarkable couple who had started it all. They would think about the woman who had fled in the night and the man who had risked everything to help her, and they would understand that true love was not about grand gestures or fairy tale romance. It was about choosing each other every day, through every challenge, and building something meaningful together. Sarah and James had done exactly that. They had taken a moment of desperation and transformed it into a lifetime of love. They had escaped darkness and found light, and in doing so, they had created a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. Their story was one of courage and compassion, of fear transformed into hope, of two souls who found each other at exactly the right moment and chose to walk through life together. It was a story that proved love could conquer even the deepest trauma, that freedom was worth any risk, and that sometimes the best things in life came from the most unexpected places. In the end, Sarah Sinclair Nolan lived to be 87 years old, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who adored her. James followed her just 18 months later, unable to imagine continuing without his beloved partner. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a tree they had planted together in their first year of marriage. Their graves became a place of pilgrimage for family members who wanted to feel connected to the couple who had started it all. Young brides would visit and ask for blessings on their own marriages. Women facing difficult choices would sit by the stones and draw strength from Sarah's story. And always, there were fresh flowers, placed by loving hands who wanted to honor the memory of two remarkable people. The inscription on their shared headstone read simply, "Sarah and James Nolan, Partners in life, partners in love, partners in building something beautiful. May their legacy of courage and compassion live forever. And it did. Their story continued to inspire generations long after they were gone, a testament to the transformative power of love and the incredible strength of the human spirit. Sarah had escaped a polygamous marriage in the night, and James had helped her disappear for good from that old life. But what they had found together was so much more than escape. They had found home. They had found purpose. They had found a love that transcended circumstances and endured beyond death itself. It was a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth celebrating. And in every retelling, the message remained the same, that it is never too late to claim your freedom, that love can heal even the deepest wounds, and that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with a single terrified leap into the unknown, trusting that somewhere in the darkness there is a light waiting to guide you home.